This is a response to 3 videos which argue for free will: evidence for free will in the brain, the case for free will, and how free will works. I will begin by discussing some fundamental problems with these videos, and then I will respond to the claims of each video in detail. There are 2 common objections to libertarian free will which these videos completely fail to address. The first is what I like to call the regress problem. This can be stated a number of ways. For example, Sam Harris says that free will implies the ability to choose what we choose.
But we can't choose what we choose in life. And when it seems that we choose what we choose, so perhaps when going back and forth between 2 options, we don't choose to choose what we choose. There is a regress here that ends in darkness. We have to take a first step, or a last one, for reasons that are subjectively mysterious.
More specifically, he has said that authoring our thoughts would require us to think them before we think them.
Thoughts just emerge in consciousness. We are not authoring them. That would require that we think them before we think them. If you can't control your next thought, and you don't know what it's going to be until it arises, where is your freedom of will? Now, at this moment, many of you are thinking, what the hell is he talking about? Okay. Here's what I'm talking about. You didn't pick that thought either.
In one of my videos, I argued that an act of will would necessarily be determined by our desires. For such an act to be free, we would have to be able to choose our desires, which would lead to an infinite regress of choosing desires, because each instance of choice is determined by a prior desire. Another frequent objection to free will is that experiments have shown that our decisions can be predicted before we are even consciously aware of them. It is argued that if this is the case, it makes little sense to say that our conscious mental effort is responsible for our decisions, as it seems our decisions have already been made and our awareness of them simply appears in consciousness after the fact.
So as a result of this work, it is actually scientifically uncontroversial to say that some moments before you are aware of what you are going to do in making a simple voluntary action, at a time at which you appear to be subjectively free to do whatever you want, your brain has already determined what it is you will do.
I'm not going to defend either of these arguments. There is nothing to defend them against because, as I said, the videos I'm responding to have offered 0 objections to them. But why stop here? In this video I'm going to show that their position can't get off the ground even in the absence of these 2 arguments. As you may have guessed from the title, I don't think the conclusions of the videos I'm responding to have any support from science. Fortunately, you don't have to have any understanding of quantum physics to refute these videos. So, all of these videos rely on quantum mechanics to claim that certain aspects of the universe are indeterministic, and I'm going to grant this to show that it gets them nowhere. Then they inevitably turn their attention to a specific indeterministic event in the brain, and thoughtlessly claim that this is the locus of free choice. There are enormous problems with this assertion. No explanation is given as to how an indeterministic event being the result of choice is even coherent. Nevertheless, I'm going to grant that this is somehow possible. Secondly, there is a perfectly coherent way in which something could be indeterministic, which is it being the result of chance. But obviously, randomness does not support free will at all. This issue is incredibly significant because there is no way for science to distinguish between an indeterministic outcome that is the result of chance and an indeterministic outcome that is the result of choice, assuming such a thing is even possible. There must be some reason for saying that the outcome is due to choice, but since causality is out of the question, how can science determine this? It can't. If any causal link is proposed, the outcome becomes determined. Notice that I'm not simply claiming that these arguments fail to prove free will, but that it is impossible for them to prove free will. Not only that, but they don't even prove the possibility of free will either. I have simply assumed that for the sake of argument. I think I've shown how easy it is to cut through the verbiage and expose the tremendous flaws in these arguments. This is why I don't find them the least bit convincing. The rest of this video will be a critical analysis of these 3 videos. This video asserts that other neurons determine whether or not a calcium ion goes through the calcium channel, and then by no reasoning at all it claims that this constitutes free will. This is a sort of two-step model in which the outcome of an otherwise indeterministic system is determined by measurement. Here's a hint for proponents of free will. If the outcome is being determined by something, we're not talking about indeterminism. The measurement apparatus or observer would have to have free will in order to choose the outcome, but free will is the very thing in question. If the actions of the other neurons are strictly deterministic, then obviously the outcome is determined and the concept of alternative possibilities goes out the window. When this was pointed out to the creator of the video, his only response was to say that determinism is absurd and leads to negative behaviors. The former isn't even an argument, and the latter is a fallacy, an appeal to consequences. If the other neurons behave in an indeterministic way, then there is no reason to refer to this interaction as choice, because there is no way to distinguish it from chance. The paper he's referring to is a philosophy paper. I'm certain someone still had to look it over before publishing it, but that was probably just to make sure it wasn't Katy Perry lyrics or a refrigerator manual. Inspiring Philosophy's video begins with a huge misrepresentation of Sam Harris. You can't summarize Sam Harris without mentioning the two objections I brought up at the beginning of this video. Instead, IP just shows this.
Recently, Sam Harris wrote a short book in an attempt to sum up the arguments for determinism and make the case that we do not have free will.
No, Sam Harris argues against free will whether or not determinism is true, but go on.
Free will is an illusion. Our wills are simply not of our own making. Thoughts and intentions emerge from background causes of which we are unaware and over which we exert no conscious control. We do not have the freedom we think we have. Free will is actually more than an illusion, or less, in that it cannot be made conceptually coherent. Either our wills are determined by prior causes and we are not responsible for them, or they are the product of chance and we are not responsible for them. If a man's choice to shoot the president is determined by a certain pattern of neural activity, which is in turn the product of prior causes, perhaps an unfortunate coincidence of bad genes, an unhappy childhood, lost sheep, and cosmic ray bombardment, what can it possibly mean to say that his will is free?
Okay, so the part that IP quotes is just Sam Harris stating the standard argument against free will, but IP is not going to address that. Instead, IP just responds to Sam Harris's description of determinism, which is not even an argument. Let's see how IP responds.
So is this true? Is everything we do completely determined by prior causes? Well, I would argue no. This argument is nothing new, and advocates of free will have long responded to it. The first thing to note is determinists like Harris seem to think that since we are unable to pick our past, our genes, our character, and various neurological factors, this means we do not have free will.
No, determinists think we don't have free will because we don't have the ability to do otherwise. Remember that bit about everything being determined by prior causes? You had it on screen about 8 seconds ago. Harris is not saying that we don't have free will just because we can't choose our genes. An accurate representation of Harris would be that even if we could pick our genes, those choices would not be free, because they would either be necessitated by a specific state of affairs or the result of chance. Again, according to determinism, our wills are determined by prior causes, and there are no alternative possibilities. It's strange that IP considers his video a refutation of Sam Harris's book, when he doesn't actually respond to any of the arguments against free will. He then gives an excruciatingly bad argument for free will, which he attributes to Ayn Rand.
The determinists say the opposite, and we can't escape it. Where else could our choices come from if they are not the result of prior causes? I believe the philosopher Ayn Rand responded to this well, and though I would not agree with her on many things, the argument for free will is very well articulated. While determinists say choices are impossible and are the result of prior causes, Rand argued man's free choices come from focusing his mind, whether to focus it or not, how much to, and what to focus on. Man can keep his mind in full focus, drift away without focus, or avoid focusing and refuse to think. We can consider all relative facts and conditions and make a conscious effort to think of additional factors that might play a part. We obviously cannot make free choices on some knowledge we acquire, but our freedom is controlling what ideas and arguments to focus on, which allows us to select what we think is truth. So advocates for free will, like Rand, do not argue there are no reasons which motivate our actions, but that we are free and in control of what facts and ideas the mind will focus on. So freedom is in focusing and thinking. As Ayn Rand said, a social environment can neither force a man to think nor prevent him from thinking, but a social environment can offer incentives or impediments. It can make the exercise of one's rational faculty easier or harder, it can encourage thinking and penalize evasion, or vice versa. So advocates of free will have never argued our free will means we must have freedom in the sense of maximal autonomy. Instead, it is argued we have free will in the ordinary sense, which happens in the rational mind through processes of thinking and focusing.
Alright, so this argument just presupposes free will. The choice to focus your mind is a choice in itself, which obviously cannot be done freely unless you already have free will. It's a circle. You have free will because you have free will. Inspiring Philosophy's video is loosely based on an article called The Free Will Theorem, which he claims proves idealism and free will. The paper is actually just about indeterminism. By free, it simply means not determined, and it makes no mention of idealism. In fact, it disagrees with IP's view that a conscious mind is required for the collapse of the wave function, which I will discuss later in this video. Towards the end of his video, Inspiring Philosophy makes a crude attempt at bolstering his argument with excerpts from actual physicists. However, a few seconds of inspection reveals his miserable failure.
Heisenberg then comes along and proposes the Heisenberg uncertainty principle and says, nonsense. There's uncertainty. You don't know where the electron is. It could be here, here, or many places simultaneously. This, of course, Einstein hated because he said God doesn't play dice with the universe. Well, hey, get used to it. Einstein was wrong. God does play dice. Every time we look at an electron, it moves. There's uncertainty with regards to the position of the electron. So what does that mean for free will? It means in some sense we do have some kind of free will. No one can determine your future events given your past history. There's always the wild card. There's always the possibility of uncertainty in whatever we do.
This is Michio Kaku saying that the future is not fixed, which is necessary for free will, but not sufficient. After all, the unpredictability of the future could be due to factors of chance. Here is Tom Hartsfield saying that quantum mechanics entails some degree of chance or randomness. This quote actually conflicts with Inspiring Philosophy's position. Inspiring Philosophy is arguing against random outcomes. I can't imagine how he thought this quote would be helpful to him. Just look at the comments and you'll see Inspiring Philosophy all over the place saying things like this. The particle collapses to a classical state when we measure it. It doesn't behave randomly. Particles behave as a wave of probability. Free will is not randomness, but the ability to determine your own choice. Where are getting this random event idea? You keep saying randomness, which shows you don't understand quantum mechanics. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle doesn't equate to random outcomes, but outcomes that depends on free choices of the observer. Thus, conscious choices in OR and ORC-OR are neither random nor algorithmically deterministic. If our actions were determined by randomness, then the outcome would be observed differently. It isn't random, it is unpredictable until an observer makes a measurement. That is not the same as being random. There is no randomness, just the inability to predict the outcome until an observer measures. And that's it for Inspiring Philosophy's video. It's completely lacking in substance and there's nothing that even resembles a cogent argument for free will. It turns out that Inspiring Philosophy does most of his arguing in the comments section, where he somehow feels safe making the most ridiculous assertions. Of course, he's not safe. I've read all of his comments and they're hilariously stupid, so I'm going to rip them apart. This nonsense keeps piling up, and I encourage anyone to go to his video and show him what a joke he is. But try not to kick his ass too hard, or this will happen. One thing IP likes to do is reference bogus articles as if their conclusions are mainstream and unquestionable. This is a paper he sent my friend No One Left Alive. Just like in the free will theorem, the paper's definition of free choice is entirely consistent with randomness. It says, Thus, according to the Copenhagen philosophy, there are no presently known laws that govern the choices made by the agent, experimenter, observer about how the observed system is to be probed. This choice is thus, in this very specific sense, a free choice. So even if all of this is to be granted, it doesn't prove the free will that IP is arguing for, because it is indistinguishable from randomness. Secondly, we have every reason to be skeptical about this paper. From what I can tell, it appears to have been written by pseudoscientist clowns. Jeffrey M. Schwartz, a mind-body dualist, signed the Discovery Institute's anti-evolution statement and appeared in Ben Stein's religious propaganda film, Expelled. Henry Stapp is the only author of this paper who has any credentials in physics, but he immediately raises red flags due to his fringe views about quantum consciousness, which are incorporated in this paper. Other physicists have claimed that Stapp's theory makes numerous errors, and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says that Stapp's theory lacks empirical confirmation, but who cares? IP didn't argue that these authors are right, he just asserted it. Mario Beauregard is another dualist with no credentials in physics. Apparently his bizarre views don't make it to any peer-reviewed scientific literature, which brings me to another point. This isn't an actual scientific paper. It's just a bunch of babble these guys decided to post in a philosophy journal. And this is what IP uses as some sort of trump card. And this next paper is more absurd because it uses the orchestrated objective reduction model, which is a little too crazy for Henry Stapp. My point is that IP needs to actually explain why his fringe views of physics are correct, instead of just citing these dubious papers. Sending people off to read technical material about quantum physics is a cop-out, especially given that he knows his audience is not comprised of physicists. This stuff clearly isn't very reliable, and I see no reason to trust it over the majority of physicists and philosophers. That's why IP should be making arguments. It's not enough to simply gesture towards sophisticated literature. Another thing I want to address is IP's absurd interpretation of the observer effect. IP seems to think that the words observer and measurement literally refer to the eyesight of a conscious person. According to IP, the particles don't exist until we look at them. This is the type of incredible claim IP likes to make at the end of a comment, as if no clarification is needed. IP is trying to sneak in some type of idealism with vague references to quantum physics. The most he offered as evidence for idealism was a tiny article he briefly went over in his video. The article looks far from conclusive, and the part that IP doesn't show quotes a physicist who disagrees with his philosophical interpretation. But seriously, if physics actually proved that things don't exist unless I'm looking at them, why am I just now hearing about it from some imbecile on YouTube? As for the observer effect, here's a video explaining it by someone who actually knows what he's talking about.
We have photons, which are elementary particles that will bounce off and reflect off of surfaces, which allows us to see them. However, when we get down to the subatomic particles, photons are like bowling balls. So a photon hitting an electron moves the electron, changes its state, so we can't ever really observe an electron without changing it.
What do we learn from this? When photons interact with electrons, the electron changes position. There doesn't appear to be any warped view of causality at work here, and I don't see any reason to say that the electron doesn't exist before this interaction. What about IP's idea that measurement depends on a conscious agent?
And so, for example, there's a classic experiment in physics called the Young slit experiment, the double slit experiment, which you can do with particles. You can do with particles like electrons, and basically you have a beam of electrons firing along and a pair of little slits, and the electrons go through, and very fundamentally, because the electron's position is not defined, you can't say which slit it goes through. It goes through both. This is one particle going through two holes at the same time. Particles really aren't supposed to behave that way, or at least on the macroscopic scale, the things we're used to dealing with. And that's why the concepts are so incredibly difficult to explain, because you have to accept that at some very fundamental level that that's the way the universe works. One thing you might do if you were doing this double slit experiment with a particle going through is say, okay, so why don't I just set up some very clever little gizmo which will actually measure whether or not a particle goes through one slit or the other. And then I can actually say which slit the particle goes through. And the amazing thing is, whatever thing you set up to detect which slit the particle has actually gone through, you can detect it. But then suddenly all the quantum mechanical effects go away. That suddenly the particle, yes, you can detect it, and it only ever, when you actually make the measurement, it only ever goes through one slit. But suddenly all the quantum mechanical effects go away. And that's this thing of collapsing the wave function. When you make a measurement, you go from a probabilistic thing, well, either the particle's here or the particle's here, to saying, on this occasion, the particle is definitely here.
So measurement in this case refers to the use of an electron detector. That's what causes the collapse of the wave function, not the vision of a free agent. And yet here IP is, stating this as fact. No, the particles do not exist until you even look at them. Everything acts like a computer simulation. When we look at it, it is there. When we look away, it is just information or potentialities. So far I've been arguing against IP's weird interpretations of quantum physics. But for the sake of argument, let's say that he's right. I'm going to grant that we live in an idealist world, and that particles don't exist unless we're looking at them. So, what does this mean for free will? Nothing. This is IP's most ridiculous blunder. He somehow forgot to show how these obscure conjectures are even linked to free will.
What you do, and what many people who try to invoke spooky physics do in the service of propping up their religious and New Age intuitions, is that they think that because what you're saying, because quantum mechanics is spooky and difficult to understand, and because what you're saying is spooky and difficult to understand, they must somehow be related, or they must somehow be mutually supportive.
All IP does is attempt to argue against determinism. According to IP, indeterminism in quantum mechanics shows that causality is not happening behind the scenes, and could be causing our actions. If the collapse doesn't happen until we observe, then the collapse is not causing us to observe. First of all, so what? Even if this refutes determinism, it doesn't prove free will. Remember that the standard argument says that we can't have free will regardless of whether or not determinism is true. Secondly, this sentence is just idiotic. Let's return to the double slit experiment. An electron is fired from a cathode ray tube at the slits. If a particle detector is placed at the slits, the electron is measured and the wave function collapses. No one on this planet thinks that the wave function collapse is causing a person to set up a particle detector, or in IP's case, look in the direction of the slits. In fact, the predominant deterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics does not even include a collapse of the wave function. But that's beside the point, because IP's argument is equivalent to saying that we must have free will because slamming a door causes it to close, as opposed to a door closing causes a person to slam it. In some of his comments, IP attempts to defend free will against an argument I mentioned at the beginning of this video, that experiments have shown our decisions are made before we are consciously aware of them. I'll let Dr. Craig explain the experiment.
One of the most famous of these would be the experiments by Benjamin Libet, where he asked patients to press a button. And what he discovered is that the neural signals in the brain to move the hand to press the button actually occurred a fraction of a second before the agent was aware of making the choice to push the button.
Dr. Craig attempts to explain this in terms of mind-body dualism, but IP can't do that because he rejects dualism. IP instead responds by casually asserting that consciousness sends signals back in time, which he thinks has been confirmed by multiple studies. Of course, it goes without saying that this has never been confirmed. The first study IP cites is the famous experiment conducted by Benjamin Libet in 1983, which showed that our actions are initiated unconsciously. Yeah, that's actually the same study that Dr. Craig and this commenter are talking about. And no, it has nothing to do with signals going back in time. However, in 1979, Libet conducted an experiment which involved subjective antedating of sensory experience. Here's a quick outline of the experiment. For either direct cortical stimulation or a pulse stimulus to the skin, 500 milliseconds is required to elicit sensory experience. In the experiment, subjects received the direct cortical stimulus followed by the skin stimulus, with about 200 milliseconds in between. The issue is that subjects reported feeling these stimuli in the reverse order, and from this Libet infers a backwards referral of conscious experience. It should be clear at this point that this experiment is at best irrelevant. Again, the 1983 experiment suggested that our conscious awareness of having made a decision appears late. The 1979 experiment demonstrated that the conscious sensation for a specific stimulus appears early, which is why Libet says that it must have been referred backwards in time. So if conscious awareness has the advantage of being referred backwards in time in the same way, yet still only appears after unconscious initiation, then it is even slower than otherwise thought. I'm not the only one to notice this. The book Conscious Will and Responsibility, a tribute to Benjamin Libet, states that the lag between unconscious initiation of action and the experience of conscious will is presumed to be even greater than measured if the conscious experience of willing is thought to be subject to backward referral. For if experiences of conscious will are backward referred, as Libet claims experiences of external events are, and if the timing is similar to the timing in the case of sensation, approximately 500 milliseconds, then those experiences actually occur sometime after the movement occurs. What IP needs the experiment to show is that there is a backward referral of unconscious activity, and that's simply not what it says. Here's another thing to consider. If IP has a point regarding these experiments, why didn't Libet make it himself? After all, he conducted both of these experiments, and he also tried to defend free will. But he did not use the same defense as IP. Instead, Libet saw the backward referral of consciousness as evidence of substance dualism. His argument regarding free will has nothing to do with it. Libet hypothesizes that if there is room for freedom at all, it is not in the conscious initiation of spontaneous action, but instead in the possibility of aborting an action whose neural underpinnings are already set in motion by unconscious processes. This possibility of freedom of the veto, or free won't, is Libet's suggestion for how to save freedom in the face of his data. IP is supposed to explain how free will can be reconciled with the fact that there's a delay between unconscious initiation and conscious awareness. But if consciousness travels back in time, all he gets is a larger delay. This is all granting that there is even a such thing as backward referral of consciousness. I have no need to dispute it, but I'm going to anyway. Patricia Churchland wrote a piece which was heavily critical of Libet's experiment. She stated that there was in fact only one subject whom Libet got backwards masking skin cortex at 500 milliseconds, and inaccuracies in ordering judgments, even on the part of normal subjects, are plentiful, and one subject can have an eccentric run of judgments. She also objects to Libet's calculations, arguing that it's plausible that it could take longer than 500 milliseconds for direct cortical stimulation to produce sensation, and that skin stimulation could be felt at less than 500 milliseconds. She concludes that Libet's evidence for temporal displacement of conscious experiences is exceedingly vapid. IP also cites 4 other studies. Searching for them took me to this article by Stuart Hameroff, where 3 of them are referenced, not as confirming time travel, but as evidence that at least 500 milliseconds is required for direct cortical stimulation to produce conscious experience. Again, this data is not at issue. As Churchland said, the question is whether or not the sensation could occur sometime after 500 milliseconds, since this figure has only been established as a minimum. It just so happens that one of the studies IP cited actually states that it could take from 0.5 to 1 second to produce conscious experience. Anyway, I'm pretty sure IP just pulled these sources from this article without reading any of them. I was able to track down all 3 papers, and not one of them even tries to confirm backward referral of consciousness. In fact, one of the papers was written by Daniel Pollan, who not only disagreed with it, but allegedly debunked it. In 2004, Pocket wrote an article in Consciousness and Cognition on the death of subjective backwards referral. She said that Pollan's evidence so seriously undermines the data interpretation underlying the notion of subjective backwards referral that it may well have finally buried it. In the same issue of Consciousness and Cognition, Pollan commented on those who agreed with his analysis of Libet's 1964 paper. Thus, I believe our results are consistent with the insights of those who have long suspected a prolonged integrative mechanism and a delayed neuronal activation following threshold direct cortical stimulation, Churchland, Glynn, Gomez, and especially Pocket, who correctly surmised the existence of a dynamic intratrain facilitatory process that we have confirmed at the single-cell level. Pocket also correctly surmised that no antedating of conscious experience is necessary to account for the result of Libet 1993 in the specific case where a peripheral stimulus is experienced before a cortically activated experience via the opposite hemisphere, because the cortical activation of adequate neuronal activity is simply delayed. This is inexcusable. If IP wants to defend this outlandish idea, the least he could do is refrain from citing people who disagree with him. The last paper IP cites is the only one that advocates some type of precognition, and of course it is extremely controversial. The list of criticisms is quite long, so I won't go into much detail, but I will say that attempts to replicate Bem's experiments supposedly failed to provide any evidence of precognition. So, out of the 4 additional studies IP cites as confirmation of time-traveling consciousness, 3 don't even suggest it, and 1 is a highly contentious experiment by a guy who believes in psychic phenomena. I've let IP have his chance to fling references. Now it's my turn. In his book Divine Foreknowledge and Human Freedom, Dr. Craig writes, having examined the evidence for backward causation in such various fields as neurology, subatomic physics, electrodynamics, parapsychology, astrophysics, and time travel, we have seen that the evidence is at best equivocal. There are no good grounds, therefore, for thinking that backward causation, even if logically possible, ever occurs or is even really possible. Dr. Craig also argues that backward causation is ontologically impossible because, according to the A theory of time, objects of the future are non-existent. However, IP holds the B theory of time. This is interesting because the A theory of time is essential for the Kalam cosmological argument. So if you're wondering why IP uses a horrible argument from contingency instead, this is probably the answer. Dr. Craig, on the other hand, is able to use both the Kalam and the argument from contingency. So everyone should go thank IP for destroying one of the most powerful arguments for the existence of God. That's all I care to say about the backward referral of consciousness. For the rest of my critique of IP, I'll be responding to miscellaneous comments. Throughout the comments section, IP constantly repeats that people who disagree with him are assuming event causation and ignoring agent causation. That might be true, but perhaps it's because he hasn't provided a reasonable argument for agent causation, or even a coherent description of it. IP says indeterminism shows that nothing is determining our actions. Once again, an outcome which is determined by nothing perfectly fits the definition of a random outcome. IP's goal is to explain how an outcome can be indeterministic yet still be controlled. Instead, IP seems to be arguing from the absurd notion that indeterminism automatically proves free will. Here's another bit of wisdom from IP. And another event doesn't cause that, but an agent. Observation entails an agent to perform the action. No, you decide to do an experiment that produces the wave pattern, as Bruce Rosenblum and Fred Kuttner explain. What you choose even loads up a back history of the past. The past didn't exist until you decided what experiment to perform. Do I really have to respond to that? When a commenter pointed out the uselessness of Ayn Rand's circular argument, IP responded by saying, then they need to prove to evidence there is a connection that is determining, not just assert it, because just the possibility doesn't make a good case. This is awfully ironic because IP's video is titled, The Case for Free Will, yet he needs to make additional videos before he gets to the free will part. IP has posted an overview of his upcoming video. I'll read it and then I'll make fun of it. If I may answer your question, here's a short overview of a future video I have planned. You're assuming event causation is the only form of causation when libertarians argue for agent causation. This makes us an acting first cause. Schwartz showed in decision-making, interaction is coming from elsewhere. perhaps a lower quantum level where topological qubits are. These exist in a superposition of outcomes, which only collapse to classic upon measurement. But this measurement is not governed by classical laws, as Schwartz found. Naundorf came to the same conclusion. Thus, the measurement comes from an underlying level where information is fundamental, not space-time. Therefore, it is immune to determinism, but also immune to randomness, as reflected in the observed outcomes of our actions.
Did you hear anything in there that convinces you?
You asked Dan what I meant by woo-woo. That is the very embodiment of woo-woo. He said, stringing together at a rapid patter of a bunch of scientific sounding words sprinkled in with some spiritual new age words doesn't mean anything.
Whatever this is, it's in serious need of explanation, and I highly doubt inspiring philosophy is capable of it. In conclusion, inspiring philosophy's view of free will rests upon a foundation of poorly integrated and controversial claims. His video, The Case for Free Will, doesn't answer any of the major objections to free will. And lastly, IP should probably consider reconciling his claims with his sources. He should also try posting the titles of the papers he is citing, and perhaps making sure that the papers are actually relevant.
And this is where the whole style and content of what you're saying is so deeply unscientific, is that there's not a physicist sitting on this stage right now. Okay, I would never be tempted to lecture a room full of 1,000 people at Caltech about physics. I'm not a physicist. You're not a physicist. And basically every sentence demonstrates that you speak on the subject.
This video uses a quantum mind theory called orchestrated objective reduction to argue for free will. Most people have never heard of OR, and Ratz's 2.5 minutes of semi-intelligible jargon is hardly an adequate explanation. The only source Ratz cites for the OR model is a Wikipedia page which states that the mathematical and scientific basis of OR is rejected by mainstream mathematicians, philosophers, and scientists. And in the criticism section, Hameroff's theory is criticized at every level and considered to be an extremely poor model of brain physiology. Primarily, Hameroff requires tubulant electrons to form either a Bose-Einstein or Froelich condensate, both of which have been experimentally disproven. And of course, the page links to articles like Penrose-Hameroff orchestrated objective reduction proposal for human consciousness is not biologically feasible. A Google search yields more criticism and some connections to Deepak Chopra, a known pseudoscientist and quantum woo huckster. Here's a conversation between Stuart Hameroff and Deepak Chopra. Let's take a look.
But Penrose came up with this idea that these separations are unstable and after a specific time t will collapse to one or the other, with the choice being...
Because of gravity?
Because of quantum gravity, because of the intrinsic nature of the universe and space-time geometry, some kind of bounciness or some kind of restorative nature to choose one or the other. But the choices are not random, whether it chooses this curvature or that curvature, whether this reality perceived is chosen versus that, depends on information embedded in this geometry, in this Planck scale geometry, which Penrose calls platonic values. So good, evil, aesthetic, ethical values can actually be embedded in and programmed into the universe, or are embedded into the universe from the Big Bang, presumably, and those can influence our choices in our conscious perceptions and choices if we're mindful and don't act rashly.
But the question is, whatever this nothingness is, from it everything came, and to it everything returns. And again, coming back to my tradition, says when we experience samadhi, when we go into this experience where observer, observed, and process become one, you are actually at ground state. And the ground state of the self, of you as an organism, is also the ground state of the universe. How could it not be? Because there's only one ground state. This ground state is immortal, and therefore there's a part of me which connects to that ground state which is immortal. And embedded in this are is the potential, or you might say the superposition of memories, desires, imagination, platonic values that exist in a superposition of possibilities, and that when I die, I probably go into this ground state, which is part of a matrix of perhaps other individuals or beings, and we're all entangled there while maintaining some kind of individuality, at least as potential, and that this has the possibility of recycling, what spiritual traditions may call reincarnation.
So here's what I said for the BBC, and I'll stand by this, although it's been controversial. Normally, even right now, our consciousness is happening in our brains, in the neurons, presumably in the microtubules, but due to changes in fundamental space-time geometry, because it's between our ears also, it's everywhere. It's happening at this
It's between our ears, but it's also part of the continuum of the whole universe, right?
Right. But normally, generally speaking, I think it's mostly constrained between our ears because of the isolation mechanisms that prevent decoherence. Although certainly it can extend with ESP and telepathy and other things. But when the blood stops flowing and the energy stops being delivered to the tissues, to the neurons, to the microtubules, the quantum information embedded in Planck scale geometry, this most basic fundamental level in the brain, can kind of leak out or dissipate to the universe at large, but remain as one entity by quantum entanglement. So
part of the matrix.
Part of the matrix, but staying together as a soul, as that person's consciousness, including their memories, and can exist outside the body in the hologram of the universe, non-local, repeating its scale. And then if the patient's revived, can go back inside the brain, and the patient is revived and says, I had this near-death experience, I was floating above my body. Now, if the patient does not survive, unfortunately dies, then it's possible that this quantum entangled information in the universe, in the matrix, can persist indefinitely and perhaps even go back into a zygote or an embryo, in which case we have reincarnation. So I'm not saying that I can prove that or that definitely exists, but given all the history we have and the lore that suggests it's possible, I would say it's scientifically feasible and plausible for that to occur. But yet the quantum information can stay entangled for a longer time in the brain, and then when it finally, the energy is completely gone, can leak out or dissipate to the universe at large. It's because it's the lowest energy process.
But yet there is seemingly some kind of perception, right? It's an out-of-body perception.
It's the same, yes, it's consciousness very much like would occur inside our body, except it's
disembodied. Disembodied perception, which would kind of fit in with the whole idea of astral bodies and astral planes and perception in these planes, the lokas of ancient lore. Right. So let me stop you there, because this is mind-boggling. You and I are having a conversation. We're in this place in New York City, which is part of the planet, and all this is being orchestrated from a two-dimensional surface somewhere on the edge of the universe in a black hole.
Information processing.
Well, the word loka in Sanskrit is related to the English word location. Right. So location in space-time as a projection of this space-time geometry depending on the frequency domain in which it is manifesting. So, there's a great story in the Vedanta of Ram, the incarnation of God. Okay, and he's born into a royal family, and his father sends him to the great sage, where we actually use some of these techniques to give people at least some experience, without drugs, without anything, into experiencing these more unmanifest domains of this consciousness. So this world that we're experiencing now is the gross world, or you might say the manifest order of space-time causality in its most so is the universe conscious?
I would say it's proto-consciousness. Proto-conscious. It's kind of dreaming. It has this pure consciousness perhaps built into it.
That is the very embodiment of woo-woo.
Ratz's video says that the probability wave is causing the probability wave to behave in a certain precise way, but this cannot be predicted as it is intrinsically probabilistic. Yeah, I think we have a word for that. It's called chance. In a comment, Ratz says, if the particle only takes on properties after measurement, then the property it takes on is due to the choice of the experimenter. Okay, but how do you know the choice isn't determined or random? He also says, the quantum uncertainty beforehand is the free choice. Well, if your definition of free will is not being able to know everything about position and momentum at the same time, then clearly we are not talking about the same thing. I'll end this with one final point. If you're going to use quantum physics to argue for free will, you should start with a simple concept of how free will could work, and then translate that into terms of quantum physics. There is no reason that free will should be coherent exclusively in quantum terms. You should be able to come up with a hypothetical model of free will which is analogous to the quantum physics model.